Hello, welcome to the HR Strategy in the Hot Seat podcast. My name's Anwen Bottois, I'm your host, and I'm the founder of Purple Sky Consulting. I'm a leadership promotion specialist, and I also have a bit of a side hustle where I focus on development of HR leaders. So as the title of the podcast suggests, this is going to be all about HR strategy and how we can help HR professionals to consider the strategic elements of HR in more depth. Now let's get started with this episode. Hi Jess, welcome to the pod.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I feel pretty honoured to be on an HR themed podcast because that's not somewhere I've ever been. So very grateful.
Absolutely. I love that. And we'll probably get more into our connection in a moment as well and on why I've asked you to be on this podcast, I'd imagine. So Jess, why don't you do a bit of an introduction for us in terms of who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I am Jessica Lorimer. I run a sales training consultancy called Selling to Corporate. And I'm also the founder of the expertiseThe directory, where we feature external suppliers into organisations that want to partner with really skilled, qualified and credible coaches, consultants, speakers, trainers and done-for-you service providers.
Brilliant. So that's how Jess and I know each other, just for the audience, full disclosure. Jess has been helping me grow my business and develop my business over the last 18 months. And it's been really transformative in terms of how I'm approaching my business growth. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years. So I'm coming up to my 5-year birthday, doing lots of different things. And this is the first time I really feel in control of what I'm doing in terms of growing my business. So if there are any independents listening to this podcast in any way, go and find Jess and we'll tell you at the end of this some more ways you can engage with Jess. So how did you get into this world?
I fell into it. I am like the world's worst entrepreneur. Never wanted to be an entrepreneur, never wanted to own a business. I thought, and my mum actually said to me when I was about 14, we'd gone on a day trip to London. She was like, one day you're going to be here racing up the escalators with a briefcase, like corner office. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then I was. and so I essentially fell into sales at 16. I got fired from a job as a barista. So it's my first day. I made 16 cups of cold coffee and they said, yeah, this isn't going to work out. And I was like, that is fair. That is fair enough. And so I ended up walking across the road, sitting at a bus stop outside a jewellery shop and got talking to a lady who wanted to buy a gift for her niece. And over the course of about an hour, I was in the jewellery shop and I was helping her pick things. And the manager, once they realised I wasn't related to this woman, asked if I wanted a job. So I got fired from a job, but also got hired for a job on the same day. And then after that, I became a really young sales manager in the jewellery space. And I got headhunted by a recruitment firm whilst I was at university. So I thought, well, how different can it be selling jewellery and people? And obviously that is very different. Also not as bad as it sounds, just to be clear. Candidates that wanted other jobs, not anything nefarious. And when your product can change its mind, that's really challenging. So I went through all of that. I thought I would end up in the corporate sales world forever. And then in 2014, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness. So I got diagnosed with ME. And because I was pulling so many hours, for anyone who hasn't worked in sales before, you might not know about the environment, but it was sort of 70, 80 hours a week, most week, once you counted client networking and drinks and all that kind of stuff. And so doctors said, look, if you don't reduce your hours significantly, you are going to be in a wheelchair by the time you're 35. And for someone who was 24 and thought they could take on the world, that was a big shock. So I kind of went, oh, I guess I'll set up a business. How hard can it be? And obviously 12 years later, here we are.
Fantastic. Oh, wow. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Those key moments in our lives that kind of push us into different spaces. Sometimes it's changing job. Sometimes it's changing completely the way you operate your life and your work, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's having those moments that make you realise what's important. And I think, for me, running a business is brilliant, and it is. But it's about focusing on the right activities at the right time so that I can actually spend the flexible time that I have doing things I want to do. We were talking about beekeeping before you hit record, and that's something I do now. And my life has become a lot more wholesome since I moved out of London. But it's that kind of thing. You have to find those moments that redirect you in life. And for me, that one was pivotal.
Yeah, mine was COVID, and I think quite a lot of that was quite impactful for a lot of people, alongside with having general challenges with anxiety, and I was ready for a break. I was ready for. I loved my career. I always thought that would be like the big thing that would keep going, and I'd keep developing at, and I'd keep progressing. And once I'd made that decision to be like, no, this is going to change. Life's going to be different now. It's really interesting, isn't it? How that then starts to shift your decision making and how you're approaching things, which I think is, really, really important. And just as much as it doesn't matter if you choose to stay in the space that you're in either. Sometimes life changes around you, and actually your work and the work you're doing is the thing that gives you purpose. I now feel that running my business is giving me the purpose that I want to have in the work that I do, but it also gives me the side benefits of having a lot more flexibility and choosing to work in a way that enables me better, that I didn't have as much control over in my work.
Yeah, and I think it's where actually it's difficult for HR professionals inside companies in a way that sales doesn't necessarily experience. And I always think that there should be a much better relationship between HR and sales, and often there isn't, because often salespeople go rogue and do things that aren't always super sensible. But it's interesting because when we talk about inside companies, how it operates, I feel bad that HR professionals will ask for the bare minimum, really, in terms of investment from an organisation to help them become a preventative function or to help them execute on commercially critical goals. And because they don't necessarily come from a sales background, they find it more difficult to have that negotiation around those budget pieces. And that often ends up meaning that, someone in sales like me has argued that everybody needs LinkedIn Sales Navigator for a whole year, and that's going to be thousands and thousands of pounds. So of course now there's nothing left for all of the important work that HR professionals have to do. And that means that it's often a really stretched and squeezed function that can feel a little bit thankless because nobody gives the recognition, I don't think, and until you understand what HR professionals do, it's impossible to give that recognition properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think paying attention to how the investments are done in a way that's valuable really does make a difference. And also how the HR invests in itself as well, as a function. I think that's my experience being in HR function and leading one is that we're quite often looking at how do we spend the money for everybody else rather than for ourselves. And that's quite risky, I think, in terms of how a function sets itself up for success. Because if you're not growing your skill set and developing your skill set, then that can be very difficult. But there's lots of other ways that you can get input into what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about having your finger on the pulse and knowing what you want the function to do ultimately, and being able to source those skills either internally or externally. And I think that's become huge, probably in the last 2 years even more so, because as the economy has changed and as companies are working with tighter budgets, particularly around permanent headcount, that's where I've certainly noticed this huge drive for specialist skill sets that can be operating within organisations for 3 months, 6 months, and getting people internally up to speed on something new and then moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Really, really important way of looking at that. So that takes us into, what are we putting in the hot seat, Jess?
Well, I'm very excited about this because I hear that we're talking about how we can support HR functions to source the right external suppliers.
We absolutely are. I've always worked with external suppliers when I was in my HR role in one way, shape or form. Sometimes it was a small element. Sometimes it was like, we've got to outsource that whole thing. So we thought it would be useful to use this episode and your skill set in terms of the how to engage with people really successfully to unpack the best way for HR leaders to approach that external consultancy engagement piece. So tell us a little bit about what you think the key things are there.
So do you know what I think is really interesting is there's always a thought around the threat of an external consultant. I think that's always a really interesting place to start.
Yeah.
Not
Oh,
always.
yes, please.
But it's interesting. So the definition, and this could be because of my background in recruitment and things, but for me, the definition of interim support is bringing somebody in with a specialist skill set or for a defined period of time or project that means that they don't require any ramping up, any onboarding, that they can come and get the job done for an organisation whilst it needs that skill set or particular deliverable. And I think over the years, and IR35 has actually, I think, been quite helpful with this. In one of the only things that I love about the regulation, but I think it has been quite helpful because over the years we had almost this blended approach where we were seeing lots of interims go into organisations but never really leave. They were just sort of staying and migrating and weren't actually working on the specialist elements that they'd been brought in for.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so that, I think, caused this culture of there's a threat here. And seeing that almost divide between permanent employees and external resource as being, well, you're just going to come in and say the same thing that employees have been saying, and then the company will do something about it. And there's almost this threat, resentment, awkward dynamic. I think that's probably the easiest place to start, to understand whether or not that's true when you're looking for an external supplier and making that decision. Are we actually in need of somebody who has a specialist skill set or who can help us work to a particular deliverable, or who we need as added resource but we don't want to incur all of the permanent headcount associated costs for? Or is it that actually we do need to invest in permanent headcount, that we train and that we onboard and that we develop skills over time and accept that actually the output may not be there for 3 months, 6 months, a year even?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So how do you think HR leaders should make those decisions and go about that decision-making process?
I think that's a really interesting conversation that has to happen almost threefold internally. And I think it should. One of my best friends, it's important to note, works in procurement. She is very senior as a procurement leader. And when we first met and I was like, oh, I work in sales, she was like, oh. Because obviously salespeople have a way of getting around all of the procurement processes.
I don't need to fill that form in. What are you on about?
Paperwork? What's that? I just want the contract done. So one of my best friends works in a senior level of procurement. And one of the things that we discuss relatively regularly is the fact that often companies will work with suppliers and those suppliers will be like, well, do you have to hold us to the contract terms? Nobody else does. Or do you have to do these things? And so actually, I think that discussion around specialist resource has to start with HR, procurement, and whatever team or function it is that requires what they are defining as a specialist resource. And there needs to be an honest and transparent discussion about, is that a specialist resource? Or is it something we have internally or have access to through a PSL? But also, is it something that's going to add value? And what I mean by that is because I think we can all agree, inside organisations, HR teams are one of the most stretched functions. They deal with everything: rewards, benefits, grievances, legal, communication. It's just all there. And so to have that honest discussion, there almost needs to be this understanding from the beginning that actually there are some things like sexual harassment training, for example, or, bringing in a fractional HR consultant to work on a particular element around pay rises or an implementation of a particular piece of technology. That can't always just be put on an internal team member because sometimes there's no other resource for them. There's no other capacity for them to do it. And you can end up with more significant problems. So I think we have to move away from this discussion around external suppliers are just an added cost and a big threat to actually, is this something that is a specialist element or deliverable that we need? And what are the defined parameters that we're happy to work within to find the right person and potentially upskill people internally as well?
I see huge benefit of that when I've seen kind of experts come in, almost that knowledge transfer that can happen just by having somebody about who's got that level of experience and understanding and can hit the ground running. And people seeing that, I think, is a really interesting way of developing your team.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And so many organisations struggled. I come from a tech recruitment background. So I was very involved with particular pieces of technology and programmes of work in HR and across financial systems and things. One of the interesting things was that companies initially would have, you'd have two camps. Either there'd be the company that hired the external supplier, got them in to do the implementation, got rid of them, implementation went much more smoothly, cost much less, usually ran to time. Then you'd have companies who would say, okay, well, we're going to upskill internally and we're going to run it. And in all honesty, they would get to a point where their implementation was successful, adoption was good, budget maybe on or over, and timelines were usually increased. But then the issue that they'd have was that this person that they'd upskilled internally would be like, great, well, there are consultants out there making tons more money than I am. Off I go.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you felt really sorry for the companies who were like, well, we've done this internally to save money, but what we've actually done here is spent more money, taken more time, and now created somebody who doesn't want to be here. Yeah, exactly. You're thinking, what? Why? You could have just had somebody and paid them however much a day. So I think, the knowledge transfer piece is really important, but it's also when you have an external supplier, you're much more likely for them to have those conversations with permanent employees around, actually, it's difficult. Being an external supplier is hard, and you are looking for work, and you are having to build relationships, and you are having to run a sales process. And so rather than creating that gap with the knowledge that they've gained, you gain people internally who've got specialist skills and who've got added expertise, but who aren't thinking, brilliant, I want to go be a day rate contractor.
Really interesting. So where do you see some of the challenges that HR leaders come up against in this space of either the decision making or then the implementation? Where does that fit for you?
I think in both. I think around sourcing particularly, it's really hard to find the right suppliers in that decision-making process. Not only identifying, should we be outsourcing or bringing somebody in, but also where do we find that? How do we start? And how do we benchmark prices and skills accordingly? Because if that's not something that you're doing in the business every day, in terms of identifying a particularly niche skill set, think about it when GDPR came in, for example, nobody knew what they were doing. No. And so most poor HR teams were like scrabbling to find a GDPR expert. But because there's no knowledge yet, because it's brand new, you end up thinking, well, are we getting the right person? Or are we just getting somebody who's read, GDPR for dummies or whatever, and hoping that they can implement? So I think the sourcing decision-making is very difficult, and identifying quality resource, especially when you're already time stretched, is a really big challenge for people leaders.
Yeah. And I think I view it from two sides. There's what my experience was internally in terms of finding somebody. And, sometimes it would be to the recruiters that I knew really well, and they knew me and they knew this kind of thing that I'd be looking for. But then there's a difference there between that interim support for something and a real specialist expert in a specific area that's going to really help you nail something very quickly or in the right way. And then there's that other side now as an external consultant, looking at it from a perspective of, okay, people are going to the same people that they've always used. That's then quite challenging sometimes to kind of get into that space, because people are reliant on the people they've already built their network with, because that's quicker. That's easier.
Yeah.
I know what I'm getting. Yeah. Doesn't always mean it's right.
No, and exactly that. It's dangerous because it often lacks innovation. If your organisation has been working with the same provider for 3 years or more on various things, yes, they know the organisation really well and that has some benefits. But also, you still need to think, are they providing the best level of service? Are we reviewing regularly our SLOs? Are we seeing the same amount of innovation? And, one of the saddest things for you and for me as external suppliers is that sometimes you'll work with an amazing company and you think, oh God, they're brilliant. And you have to exit them and offboard them because at that point you have to say, look, you need a full-time sales director now, or you need a full-time HR consultant who's focused on this area. Whereas I think that what some HR, and it is people who are stretched and who don't want to be sucked in by the good marketing, they want the right resource, they're having to rely on referrals. They're having to rely on who their colleagues have used at other places. They're having to rely on, have we seen anyone before? Has anyone else run a training? What's on the database? And that doesn't always mean getting the breadth of experience or expertise that's required, but it also takes a lot longer. Because half of the people, when you say, oh, who do you know who does X? They're like, oh, this person was doing it, but that was 5 years ago. I don't know if they're still around or if they're not doing it anymore. And you're like, oh, well, brilliant.
Yeah. So if you're a HR director or leader, or you're tasked with delivering on an element of the HR strategy, and you've made that decision that you've got to probably go for an external expert, not an interim, external expert, you're not going to be able to fill this internally because it's either a short-term thing or you haven't got capacity, or it's not right that it's delivered internally. It's the expert thing is the right way to approach that. What are your top tips then for doing that in a way that's going to really help you to nail that element of your HR strategy?
So the first thing is have a really clear brief from the outset. And I used to say this when I was in recruitment, and I was always very blunt with my clients then, so I will be blunt now. What happens when you start searching is that you start to see people with different skill sets. And you think, oh, well, we'd like a little bit of that. And we'd also like a little bit of this. And we'd like a little bit of that personality and whatever. And then you end up looking for a unicorn instead of a defined expert. So the first thing is to have that conversation internally. What is the actual external expert that you need? And what are the key things that they must have outside of all others? And stick to that, review it regularly and look at whether you are searching through that lens. The second thing is not to let a junior go off onto Google. And I see this all the time. And it's really unfortunate because once you've exhausted your referral network, the temptation is to say, let's let a junior colleague go out onto Google, find whoever they can, and sort of send inquiries. This does two things. So one, it's difficult for a junior employee because often they don't understand the brief and they aren't always given other information that would make a difference. So they don't understand the budget. They don't understand the timeline around it. They're not sure, what level of experience really matters, whether that's in years or whether that's in particular aspect of expertise. So they end up going around and finding the best marketers that they hope fit the bill. So the people who've written the most blogs on Google, or they nowadays, junior employees, because I'm a dinosaur, they go on to AI, right? They're using large language model platforms to ask, who's the best leadership coach? Who's the best, fractional accountant or whatever you're looking for? So they find the best marketers and they don't have the ability yet to define experience and expertise, and they don't have all the information required. So that then hacks off whoever they do find. And that becomes really irritating. As an external supplier, when I get an inquiry from a junior HR employee, I will always go back and say, happy to have a chat, but it would need to be with a senior decision maker because there are questions I need to ask so that I can present the right solution. And I'll also ask, is this a benchmarking exercise? Or is there a valid need? Because as an external supplier, I also don't have hours and hours and hours to have endless discussion, present solutions, work hard on proposals, only for an organisation to take that to their preferred supplier and say, can you do this, but for a third of the price, right? So I think we have to make sure that we're getting the right brief and the right person to look at it. But we also have to think about, credibility markers and things. What qualifications do people have? Are we actually sourcing people in the right platforms? And that is where something like, obviously I'll plug the Expert Services Directory because it's free for organisations to use, but that's where something like the Expert Services Directory could be really helpful, where you have clear categories of supplier and they've had to outline their qualifications, their areas of specialism, and you can then get in touch and say, all right, we're thinking about doing this. We'd like an honest discussion about how much it'll cost. We're not sure when we want to do it, but is it possible? How does that work? And I think that is A, time saving, but B, it allows you to talk to people who've invested significantly in their learning and development, who've invested significantly in becoming the expert in a very particular area, and also people who are happy to give that knowledge transfer internally and upskill as they go.
Yeah, I love that. What I love about the directory is that it's not just endless numbers of people. And that's what's great about it, because quite often, really, and I'll comment on these or kind of share people, you'll see on LinkedIn, can you give me a recommendation for X? And then it's like 50 million responses. And then somehow you've got to navigate through that to figure out who you start having conversations with, because that's really helpful, but also a bit nightmarish all at the same time. Or like you say, you stick it into Google, you stick it into AI, you stick it into LinkedIn. And where do you even start? And I think that's what I love about the directory, is that there's a finite amount of spaces in there.
Yeah, we only have 10 suppliers per category and location. So if organisations want to, they can really drill down and say, well, we want the 10 best leadership coaches in London to do face-to-face work. Or equally, we want a menopause specialist who can come in and do awareness sessions in South Wales or work virtually or whatever that looks like. I think that gone are the days where directories should have been like the yellow pages, and everyone, you'd been lucky because your name starts with A, so you'd have been okay. But everyone who had a name starting with A was right at the front. Everyone else never got searched, were right at the back. It's that kind of thing. With the Expert Services Directory, we're looking at 10 key suppliers in each category, and we vet everybody. And that's the interesting thing. We invite people to apply. On that application, we do a lot of due diligence around it. What qualifications does that person have? How do they think that they actually benefit organisations? How long have they been an external supplier? And, what have they worked on project-wise that has been useful to clients? So something like that does take a lot of the stress out of it. And because it is free to use for organisations, they can submit as many inquiries as they like and know that each person they have inquired with is a capable, credible professional, rather than just being really great at SEO.
And that makes a huge difference, doesn't it? It's about getting the expert, not getting the marketing piece that kind of is shiny, but actually isn't about getting you to solutions. And it also means that what you're dealing with, or who you're dealing with, is somebody who knows how to have a conversation with you about your requirements as well, which I find really interesting and ties back to that piece around your brief and knowing, is this the right approach to go down an external route? Because actually I've had conversations sometimes with people where it's like, actually I'm not the right solution, or actually maybe an external isn't. Have you thought about doing X, Y, and Z instead? That's what an expert will give you.
And that's the thing. If I look at the last 10 years of my career, I've trained over 30,000 people. And a lot of those people have gone on to be sales managers and sales directors themselves. And they're then teaching their teams, and that's happened. I've only gone in once or twice, but that knowledge transfer has happened. Or like you say, you're able to advise, actually, if you've already got these components, you can probably do some of this yourself. But here's the piece that you would need extra support with, but the rest of it, actually, you can do that internally, we can create a plan, and it's nice and easily done. So I think that it is the risky piece, isn't it? When you are talking to external suppliers, I think there is always that temptation to think, wow, they just want more contracts and they want more money. Actually, it's a really short-sighted business plan. And any good external supplier will tell you that, is that they are not interested in the initial contract. They're interested in building a relationship, because when you, as an HR leader, move to another company or you get asked for a referral, you will always remember the external suppliers who were consultative in approach, who diagnosed the problem effectively, who gave you good advice, who you bought from and were amazing, or you didn't buy from, but their sales process was really good and they were able to give you solid advice about not needing to spend that money now. So
Absolutely.
those good external suppliers will want to cultivate that relationship and add value over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as somebody who's in the directory, what I value from it is that that's the type of people I want to be working with. You know, I want to be working where I can be a true expert in the area that I work in, and I'm not trying to oversell kind of massively amounts of stuff, but to get to conversations quickly. So I've got a really great example at the moment where I'm working with a brilliant client. I went through a tender process for that through a referral. And what's really interesting about that for me as an expert in what I do is that I had then a lot less control over the sales process and the brief and that side of things. However, I'm now in a position where we're going to start having conversations about what might happen next. And what I'm now able to do is step in and go, you know, that thing that you really wanted, actually, maybe we don't need to do that way. Because now I've got data about your organization and I've got my expertise that I can bring into that conversation. If we'd started from a place of just working through what their transformation was and what they wanted as an outcome, maybe we'd have got to that point quicker because we'd have gone through a proper conversation around that rather than a tendering process.
Exactly. And it leads us back to that point around junior employees struggling to source the right external suppliers because they don't have that commercial acumen yet. Not to say that they won't develop it, and it's not to say that HR leaders shouldn't involve them in processes, that they can get them up to speed quicker and upskill internally for sourcing. But it is to say that an external supplier is always going to have questions, particularly when you are bringing them in for something that is an expert or specialist resource, that a junior employee just isn't confident enough to ask or answer and know the difference between.
Yeah.
And that's really problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're having direct conversations with experts up front, you can shape the requirement. And that's what we'll do with you. Help you shape better transformations because we're having the right kind of conversation with you. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, you're not going to your optometrist and saying, can you also do my heart operation?
No.
Please know the difference. You know, that's not the case. So when you're working with an expert, you're working with somebody who, yes, on the face of it might seem expensive in comparison to what you would spend on a monthly salary or an annual salary. But the reality is you're also significantly decreasing the timeline of the work being undertaken and done to a high level, particularly if you find the right person. You know, if you find the wrong person, obviously that might have a different impact. But should you find the right person, you are significantly decreasing your costs, you're significantly increasing the knowledge transfer in the organisation, and you're also putting commercially critical outcomes at the forefront of everything that you're trying to deliver and achieving that.
Yeah. And that's what experts want to deliver on.
Yeah.
They want to create transformation. That's, you know, quite a lot of the time, that's why we're in our own businesses now, because we wanted to focus on truly the stuff that we are excellent at, or that we really wanted to help make transformations around. So yeah, I find that really interesting in terms of like, this is why you go to an expert, because actually they are the geekiest of geeks about that thing.
And that's it. And it's one of those interesting things because there is always the cost question. I think that is important to acknowledge. But when we look at expertise and external expertise in comparison to monthly salaries or annual salaries, we're also looking at the fact that that expert has significantly invested, usually at their own expense, into their development, they are able to decrease those timelines, but also you're not having to pay sick leave. You're not having to pay national insurance. You're not having to pay holiday pay. You're not paying a company car benefit. So actually in comparison, it works out much more financially viable for an organisation to hire an expert and get the thing done than it does to hire somebody on a permanent headcount for what is a specialist area and hope that they stay after you've ramped them up and that they do the work and that they don't just take all the great benefits and in a year's time find some other company that they can do the same in.
And you've still not fixed, maybe,
Yeah.
or it's not quite got to where the level you wanted to. So, yeah, really interesting. Anything else in the tips that you wanted to share?
I think, what I would always say is the best tip for HR leaders who are looking to resource in specialist areas is to have honest conversations. I think the worst thing, and because HR leaders generally are these awesome, warm people who don't want to disappoint anyone. And I think sometimes that can lend itself to sales conversations with external experts or even processes where they will want to keep somebody happy and not disappoint them at the cost of what they actually need. And I think that there is much more room for HR leaders to be very open about and transparent about their budget, their key deliverables, and whether or not somebody is performing in the sales process so that they can get the best supplier for them. And I think that honest conversation breeds a much better response from an external expert and gives you more options, about the level of transformation that you can reasonably expect with the budget that you want to pay, and also whatever else is going on in the market that is impacting that.
Yeah. And I think open to that honesty coming back as well.
Yeah.
Being willing to listen to I can see that's where you're wanting to get to with that, and that's what you're thinking. Can I share some alternatives that we could maybe get a better result from?
Yeah.
And not to feel like this back into the threat zone. This isn't a threat. This is a desire to help you really achieve something brilliant in terms of what you're doing. So I think that openness two-way, I think is really valuable. But I know as an external supplier, I don't want fluff.
No.
I don't want to be having to figure out what you're trying to achieve. I just want it direct, just as much as if it's a no for now. Just do it direct. My feelings will not be hurt. I will be more damaged by not having an honest conversation, not knowing what you need from me, and not knowing where you feel you are with me.
100%. 100%.
Much easier. Love that. So, Jess, any final tips for HR leaders in terms of how they can really execute their HR strategy really well?
Yeah, like I say, I'm not the expert in HR strategy. I'm a humble sales consultant. I think, though, that in the current climate where we are seeing significant reductions in permanent headcount across the board, one of the tips that I would have around executing HR strategy is identify what can be done reasonably internally that doesn't add weight on your staff and the current remit that they're having to fulfill. And for everything else, have those commercial conversations internally around these are the things we need to source externally so that our staff can actually be given the best possible way to execute in their areas of specialism internally, and practice almost building those business cases and saying those business cases, because that's that's the big piece, isn't it? Actually going to the board and saying, we need this money and this is what it's going to allow us to do. And so I would say practice having those conversations so that when you do it, you feel really confident, really empowered, and you know that you are giving your permanent staff the most potential capacity and ability to thrive in their job while someone else does the bit that nobody really wants to touch.
Yeah. And I think that business case piece and the kind of really thinking that through, experts will help you identify business case critical points as well. So, reach out to those experts, because if you're not sure about how to sell X, Y, and Z, guess what?
They will be.
know. So yeah, I love that element of it, and because it's not easy. It's not easy making those decisions, but with the right choices around the investment that you're making and how you're making that, you really can have a huge impact in terms of what that looks like, and therefore getting more money in future to spend again. And I think that's sometimes that gets lost when we're thinking about HR strategy. It's like, oh, I'll get that money and I'll do as much as I can with it, rather than let's do what's really impactful and then go back and get more money when we've shown that we can have huge impact by doing the right things up front. So yeah. Thank you for that, Jess.
No, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's been lovely. I've loved this conversation. So where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm over on LinkedIn. So you can find me. I'm Jessica Lorimer on there, which is funny, really, because I always introduce myself as Jess, but there you go. The formality lives with me. And you can obviously check out the Expert Services directory over at the expertiseThe.com. And, you're more than welcome if you think I'm an HR leader, but I know we need an external expert, but I'm not sure what we need. Always drop me an email through the contact form on there, and I can always make recommendations for the suppliers, because that's one of the best bits of my job, is that I get to know our suppliers really well. So I can always give you suggestions on which ones would be a good fit for you to explore building that relationship with for specific projects in those specialist areas.
Definitely. Just go and have a nose at the Expert Services directory and have a look round. And, you never know, there might be some points of inspiration that come from that. So there are blogs on there that some of the experts have been writing.
Including yourself?
Including me. So I'll make sure I'll make sure there's some links to those things as well in the notes. So, but yeah, feel free to reach out to the Jess directory or I'll say that again. Feel free to reach out to Jess directly. And, me too. If you want a perspective from an expert side of things, I'm more than happy to share that as well. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been absolutely brilliant. And I really appreciate all the hard work that you do with HR teams and in supporting their leaders internally to grow and develop as well.
Thank you for joining this episode of HR Strategy in the Hot Seats. Please leave us a review. Let us know what you think about this episode. What did you think about the topic? If you have any thoughts on topics, themes, questions, guests you'd like me to cover in future episodes, please do let me know. Get in touch with me via LinkedIn or drop me an email at anwen@purpleskyconsulting.co.uk. Hope that you could join us on the next episode, and make sure you share this with any of your network too. Thank you.